Hi, welcome to International Law 1, Week 2. Today in the online lecture we will very briefly talk about what international law is and what its main objectives are. And then in the live session we will discuss these further. Our main focus throughout this course will be public international law, which is quite different from private international law. So whenever we refer to international law within this course, we will be referring to specifically public international law. The classical perception of international law sees it as the set of rules and norms and laws that regulate interstate relations. On the one hand, regulation is a general characteristic of all laws. On the other hand, law is also prescriptive, which means that it tells us how we ought to act in our relations with others. In this regard, in the contemporary sense, international law both has a regulative and a prescriptive character. And while states still are the primary subjects of international law, in today's world, they are no longer its only subjects. In the light of this, in very general terms, contemporary international law comprises of those rules and norms that regulate the conduct of states and other entities that have international personality, such as international organizations, other non-state entities, as well as individuals to a given extent. When we look at the history of international law, we see that its roots lie in the ancient times, like in the times of the 16th century BC, as in the example of the silent trade agreement between the Carthaginians and the tribes in North Africa, where without talking to each other, without facing each other, they would do their trades. The roots of international law itself is generally traced back to the Middle Ages. And with the advent of great universal religions, broadly based systems of world order became possible. And in that regard, the Christian and the Islamic societies, for instance, defined their own worlds and their own laws. But when we look at the main distinction that lawyers make, we see the differentiation of jus naturale, which means natural law, and jus gentium, which means the law of peoples. These two are distinct while they are closely connected. Jus naturale is more broad and applicable to all, including the animal kingdom. Hence, universal in the natural world. It refers to something like what we would now call a body of scientific laws. It is considered to be universal and eternal, and its basis is reason. And it is believed that humans did not make this law, but they can apply their gift of rationality to realize its content. On the other hand, the law of peoples, jus gentium, is the human component and is seen as universal in the human world. It is purely a human creation, unlike jus naturale, and a product of human will and initiative. It is subject to alteration from time to time and can vary from place to place. It is created by and applicable to states, and it constitutes international law in the modern sense of the term. During the Middle Ages, state practice was built on traditions inherited from ancient times. The idea of diplomatic immunity started to be practiced, and European states began to conclude bilateral treaties of guaranteeing fair treatment to each other. Those concluded with the Muslim states guaranteed privileges to foreign merchants of the contracting states, for instance. And in the meanwhile, the law of war began to develop. During the classical age, which refers to 1600s and 1815, philosophers of law such as Francisco Suarez, Emerich de Battel, and Hugo Grotius contributed to the development of laws, such as the law of the sea, as we see in the example of the law of the sea with the cannon shot distance. The very first territorial sea limit was determined on the basis of cannon shot distance, which was 3 nautical miles. And in general terms, in terms of the historical evolution of international law, we see that war and peace settlement led to further development of international law. And with the establishment of the League of Nations right after the First World War and its legal institution the Permanent Court of International Justice, which unfortunately couldn't be very permanent. And then in the 1929 we have the Geneva Conventions. We see further development of international law. And we see a move away from customary international law into written international law. And with the establishment of the United Nations and its legal organ, the International Court of Justice, we see contemporary international law at its peak in terms of development. So when we look at what international law is for, basically we see that there are different views. While cynics do not consider it as law to begin with, to a certain extent, or some other cynics see it as a way to impose control over weaker states, others place a lot of importance on it. So, for instance, as you will see in your international relations course, realists argue that international law is made by the powerful states to assert their influence and to serve their interests. But from the point of liberal institutionalism, for instance, and the English school of thought in international relations theory, international law is a standard of criticism and a means of controlling those in powerful positions. So it is a means of maintaining and preserving international peace and security. When we look at the nature of international law, a common confrontation is that, is international law law? So in general terms, is it possible for us to say there is no law, no crime, and therefore no punishments? Well, from the viewpoint of mainstream international relations theories, we live in an anarchic world. What does this mean? Anarchy means, in the sense of international relations, the absence of a higher authority above states. So in that regard, states conduct their own relations and there is no higher authority to control their behavior in that specific regard. But in contemporary international relations, we do have international organizations and mainly intergovernmental organizations, and they can exert some influence over states. Also, states do exert some influence over each other. So it's not necessarily possible for us to say that there is no law, because in the contemporary era, states are willingly entering into international relations and they are entering into treaty obligations and they conduct treaties. So as we will see in the forthcoming weeks when we study the sources of international law, a basic source is international conventions. And international conventions give us the written part of international law. So we do have laws. And in that regard, as the basic principle of nullum crimen sine lege, which means that no crime without law. If we have defined laws, then we can define the crimes. In that regard, when a state commits an act of aggression, which is considered to be a crime against peace, for instance, then there are consequences, because international law, as we will see once we are studying fundamental principles of international law, aggression is something that is prohibited. So there is law, there is crime, and there is also sanctions. And these sanctions can be applied by states individually, collectively, or by international organizations. Despite the fact that we are living in an anarchic world, this doesn't mean that there is no law, no crime, and no punishments. So, considering the fact that law by itself cannot coerce states or force states in issues which are primarily political, then maybe those cynics who consider international law not to be a law, they simply have over expectations about international law. On the other hand, we also cannot expect international law to determine the specific policies of states on its own. And we cannot see law as a remedy or a solution in itself, but it tells us how to behave, how we ought to act in our international relations, and it is a means of handling particular situations. As we study peaceful methods of resolution in the second part of the semester, we will see legal settlement methods and how they help to resolve disputes between states without resort to use of force or without resorting to war. So, In basic terms, when we look at the objectives of international law, we see that by setting the rules of the relationship, international law aims to promote international cooperation and create an environment of peace and security and justice, as well as favorable conditions for coexistence of all international actors. Yet, the problem with public international law is that it is still dependent on the will of states. So, as we will discuss on Monday during our live session, a question for you to think about is, can we say that international law functions effectively? And based on this point, we will elaborate further on the relationship between international relations and international law. So, leaving the answer of the question aside, let me touch upon the relationship between the discipline of international relations and international law. Despite the fact that these two are distinct disciplines, they are separate, they do overlap with each other. International law and international relations have common concerns as well as key differences. But basically, at the core of both, at the beginning of the international relations discipline and the very aim of international law, is the wars. How can we stop wars? So while international relations, to begin with, has studied how to end wars or how to avoid wars, international law gives us the tools to do so and to achieve peace. In that regard, both international relations and international law study the behavior of states. One tries to understand the behavior, while the other tries to exert some limitations over the behavior of states in order to create an environment of coexistence and peace and justice. So, while completing your reading assignments for this week, please keep in mind the question: what is the main purpose of international law, and can we say that international law achieves these objectives? Can we say that international law is being effectively applied? See you in class.